Okay, so welcome everybody to this seminar on entitled EU's Global Strategy, A Stronger Europe in a Fragile World. We are very fortunate to have Director Nathalie Tocci from the Italian Institute of International Affairs with us here today to give us her insights on EU's global strategy. And she is also very well placed to talk about this for many reasons. First of all, because she is an excellent scholar and she has just written a book on this topic that has been published by Palgrave. A book that reflects upon the development of EU's security and foreign policy from the last 13 years, since the launch of the European Security Strategy in 2003 until the recent global strategy that was published in 2016, and also looking a little bit on the current implementation of it. But also because she was the one responsible for drafting the global strategy on behalf of High Representative and Vice President of the Commission, Federica Mogherini, a strategy that was published in June 2016, just after the referendum in UK. And many things have happened since you finalized your work on the strategy, and even more since you started the work on it. It has been, in some way, a roller coaster from optimism to pessimism with regard to European integrations, and now to a renewed optimism again, at least as I see it. Some months back, many feared that we had seen the beginning of the end of the European integration process. With Brexit, the election of Trump, and the rise of populism and anti-European forces in Europe, things didn't look very good. And before that, we also had the Ukraine crisis and the immigration crisis. But after the election of Macron in France earlier this year, and also the renewed period of Merkel in Germany now recently, there is now a renewed optimism with regard to the prospect of developing a stronger Europe. But as the subtitle of this seminar and your book indicates as well, it will be a stronger Europe in a fragile world. And there are many challenges that has to be overcome. We have, of course, Brexit that I just mentioned, and other internal challenges such as populism, Euroscepticism, separatist movements, and radicalization. And externally, we have a more challenging transatlantic relation, a more assertive Russia, climate change, migration, ISIS, to mention some. Nathalie Tocci's role as an excellent scholar and a special advisor to Mogherini has given you an unique access to and knowledge of a wide range of complex structures and actors, and at the same time remaining sufficiently detached from kind of the official processes to manage to be objective. And this is why we really look forward to listen to you here today. In addition to being a director of the Institute of International Affairs in Rome and a special advisor to Mogherini, Nathalie Tocci is also honorary professor at the University of Tübingen and editor of the International Spectator. Previously has also had research position at the Center for European Policy, studies in Brussels, at the Transatlantic Academy in Washington, and Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies in Florence. So, Nathalie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pernille. And does everyone hear? Yeah, I think it's working. So thanks, Pernille, and thanks again to NUPI for hosting me again here in Oslo. I'm really delighted to be here. And indeed, what I wanted to do today is really to not talk you through this book, because hopefully you're all going to, after the seminar, go and buy it and read it, but really give you a bit of a sense as to why this book came about and what some of the sort of inside story behind all this is. So let me just begin by saying a few words as to why I decided to write this book. So the idea came when I was sitting in a beach in Sri Lanka after what had essentially been two extremely complicated and certainly tiring years, because the truth is that to produce the global strategy, it actually took the best parts of 2 years. I mean, the work essentially, I mean, the very first idea came basically in the fall of 2014. So as Federica Mogherini was about to take up her position as HRVP, I remember first putting the question to her in September of that year. So she started her mandate in November, and asking her whether she would be interested in producing a new strategy. Already, you know, people like me in the world of academia and think tanks were already saying and thinking for a long time, you know, the 2003 strategy is kind of a bit out of date. You know, it has been around for far too long, and certainly the world does not look so prosperous, so secure, and so free as that strategy had started out. So anyway, it took the best part of 2 years really to produce the strategy. And once, you know, that baby had been delivered, I really felt, you know, as I was kind of finally relaxing, that there had been so many thoughts and memories and anecdotes that I'd lived through in those 2 years. And I really, at a very superficial level, just wanted to fix it all in my mind and therefore on paper, because that's how I tend to function, before all those memories faded away. So that was a very first initial impulse, if you like, that I had. But then when I started thinking a bit more deeply about it, it became obvious to me that there was actually another reason why I wanted to do it. And it's basically a reason that goes to the heart not only of this book, but also of what I wanted to say to you today. And it's basically a story about different worlds that meet. It's the world of politics, the HRVP herself. It's the world of institutions, of officials and diplomats. And it's the world of people like myself that come from outside, and most of you that come from outside. The world of think tanks, the world of universities, of civil society, etc. And it's true that whereas we all are interested in the same things, we're all interested in Europe, in the European Union, and foreign policy, and we tend to work actually on very similar, if not the same issues, the truth is that actually there is far too little, in my view, interaction, real interaction, and mix between these different worlds. Yes, there are conferences, there are meetings. If you're an academic, you go and do your interviews, but they're all very limited in time, moments of interaction. And what I felt from the experience that I lived through was, on the one hand, it became very obvious to me, as I'll be then describing in the rest of my talk, that the global strategy, good or bad, as you may think, but it would certainly have been very different had it been written exclusively from within the machinery. But then so I felt that, if you like, that was the contribution of the world I was coming from that brought, if you like, to this process and to this product. But then I thought, you know, at the end of this process, that payback time had come, and that it was also my responsibility as someone that was coming from the outside to, in a sense, share the experience that I'd lived through with others like myself, like all of you. So I really felt this sort of urge of sharing an experience and telling a story as to, as I said, how this particular process and how this particular product would have actually been very different had it been concocted only by one of these different worlds. So let me just begin by saying a few words as to why there is an EU global strategy. And that is really, I think, the key question. And it's the question that was posed to me when I phoned up the person that had been in my shoes 13 years before. That is Robert Cooper, who on behalf of Javier Solana had drafted the European security strategy. And when Federica decided to entrust to me this task, I phoned Robert up and I asked him for some advice, as one does. And Robert asked me, the very first question that he asked me was the most important to me in the next couple of years, which is, why are you doing it? And you know, I was going to start scratching my head. Why are we doing it? I mean, obviously, we kind of thought about it, and this had been somewhat in between, you know, the lines of many of the conversations that I'd had with the HRVP, but I'd never really sat down and sort of schematically thought through, why is it we're doing it? And the why, of course, in the case, and the reason why Robert asked me that question was that the why in the case of the 2003 European security strategy was a very clear why. This was the time in which Europe and the transatlantic relationship had been very deeply divided over the war in Iraq. And essentially, the European security strategy was a means, in my view, a very successful means, of recreating a narrative within which these different divisions, if you like, could be bridged over. And if you think about that why question and the answer that was given to that why question back in 2003, you understand the specific choices that were made in the 2003 European security strategy. You know, why, for instance, pick effective multilateralism? Well, you know, multilateralism, that heeded more to the French and German position at the time in defense of the United Nations system. Effective tended more towards, a more, if you like, the Anglo-Saxon, UK, but also obviously US critique of multilateralism, saying, well, you know, it's got to be effective. It has to be able to deliver. If you think about terms like preventive diplomacy, again used in the 2003 European security strategy, very much a reply, a European reply to George W. Bush's preemptive action, preemptive strikes. I can't remember exactly how it was framed back then. So that why question was critical in 2003, and so the reason, rightly so, that Robert asked me that question is that the answer to that question would have determined the way in which 13 years later the security strategy or global strategy, I'll come to this in a minute, would have actually taken shape. So I start scratching my head as to that why question and talking to many people, obviously beginning with the HRVP, but also having first conversations within the institutions, both in the EAS and in the Commission, of course with the member states, but also knowing what the debate was from my own world, as I said, the world of universities and think tanks. It became obvious to me that there were in this case, three particular reasons why a new strategy was necessary. And those three, oops, I'm sorry, I forgot to do this. And those three reasons essentially determined the approach that was taken to the strategy, the content of the strategy, and the timing of the strategy. So motivation number one, which I called the bureaucratic rationale for a new strategy. And this was obviously the rationale that was coming from the institutions, from the officials, from the diplomats, particularly from the officials, I would say. And it was essentially, to put it in the most simple terms, the strategy as a means of implementing the Lisbon Treaty. What do I mean by this? The Lisbon Treaty had already been in being for 5 years, and as a consequence of the Lisbon Treaty, a number of innovations were introduced when it came to European foreign policy, and in particular the creation of the double-hatted HR and VP role, the creation of the EAS, essentially the creation of a hybrid, the creation of hybrid institutions, a hybrid system that would bring together the external relations side, coming obviously from the Commission, with the more traditional foreign and security policy side, coming from the Council and therefore the member states. Now, those first 5 years of implementation of the Lisbon Treaty had not been a spectacular success in terms of actually giving life to this hybrid. We know, and certainly when we came towards the end of 2014, there was also quite a lot of fatigue about the institutional turf wars in Rond-Point-Schuman. Not that those turf wars have disappeared, but certainly back then there was this very strongly felt feeling that it was necessary to turn the page. And it's true that the first HRVP, Cathy Ashton, and I don't feel anyone can blame her because she did have a really difficult task ahead, but it's true that she did, by most accounts, drop basically her hat as Vice President of the Commission fairly early on. So new Commission starts, new HRVP starts, and there is this general desire to try and turn this page and try to really implement the Lisbon Treaty. And hence the approach to the strategy, meaning a strategy that would not only be a security strategy, but a strategy that would be a global strategy. And it would be a global strategy not only because it would be global geographically, but because primarily it would be global thematically. And by thematically, it would therefore bring together the diplomacy and the defense, if you like, side of things, together with the trade and the development and the humanitarian assistance and the energy and the migration and therefore a first bureaucratic rationale for a strategy which determined its entire approach, what I would say is a sort of essentially bureaucratic and institutional rationale. Second reason why the strategy came about is, I would say, a reason that comes largely from the world outside. Now, what did the world outside end up looking in 2014, beginning of 2014? Well, it's a very messy world. A world of crises and conflicts erupting everywhere, from the east to the south to within, of course, the European Union itself. And of course, when you are in crisis mode, you tend to react, and therefore you don't, there is a general lack of an overall sense of direction of where is it you're going. There is all reaction, very little pro-action, if you like. And this was a critique that came particularly from our world, the world outside, the world of think tanks, the world of universities, essentially criticizing the EU for, on the one hand, an absence of strategic vision and strategic action, and on the other, a sort of EU that was slightly losing its bearings. You know, for a long time, there had been this general sense that the European Union is a normative foreign policy actor. This is something that has filled pages and pages of journals and books on European foreign policy. And then all of a sudden, I mean, there was always a debate of, well, is it really so normative, or doesn't it just pursue its sort of crude interests? But this was the overall terms of the academic debate, I would say. And then all of a sudden, you have a world which is filled with conflicts, with crises, in which indeed there is all this reaction, in which there is the tendency, therefore, to start acting in a more geopolitical or realist, or if not even realpolitik way. And so essentially, there was, I think, a real need back then to develop a strategy that would somehow conceptualize a new way of doing European foreign policy, a way which, on the one hand, would remain true to the values and the principles, but on the other, it would recognize and acknowledge that we live in a messy world. And it's a far messier world than the one that we thought we lived in back in the early 2000s. And this is where, for instance, notions such as principled pragmatism come in, a notion that is very much at the core, if you like, of the global strategy. And it's a notion that came from my exchanges with the academic and the think tank world. So I think that was a big value added of that world onto the global strategy. And essentially principled pragmatism that could come across as looking like an oxymoron actually isn't. Because basically what it means is there needs to be the pragmatism in terms of the assessment of the situation. And the situation can be very messy. And there are no easy ways out, even if you want to do the absolutely, sort of ethical thing, to do. So therefore the pragmatism has to come in the assessment, but we have to be obviously guided by our own principles in the way in which we approach that situation. And it's being guided by your own principles in a way which doesn't impose those principles on others, or even take for granted that those principles are shared by others. That's where the pragmatism has to come in. But we have to be true to ourselves, basically, in the way in which we act in foreign policy. So I would say that that second rationale, which is, in a sense, a policy rationale, which is very much linked to, as I said, this world outside that I was personally coming from, also had, I think, a deep impact on the way in which the strategy itself was conceived and approached. Then the final rationale, which is possibly the most important, is the political rationale. And the political rationale essentially determined not only a lot of the content, but above all, I would say, the timing. So this was the rationale that I would say was mainly coming from the HRVP. And this is the story about unity and the importance of unity. And it's a similar rationale to the rationale back in 2003. As I said, even back in 2003, the whole aim was that of bringing back the member states, and in particular France and Germany on the one hand and the United Kingdom on the other, after the divide over Iraq. In 2014, 2015, We were not so lucky as to have only one divide. There were many divides. We were divided over Russia, we were divided over the Eurozone, we were divided over migration, we were divided on different understandings of the role of European defense, and the list, if you like, continues. And so basically, the political aim, I would say, of the strategy, the political rationale of the strategy that was coming from the political level, was a strategy that could create and recreate a narrative within which these divisions would not necessarily be removed and subside altogether, but they would somehow be bridged somewhat. And that third rationale was critical in determining the timing of the global strategy. And here we come to the whole Brexit story. Now, in all honesty, when we were working on the global strategy, the assumption was that if there were to be a Remain vote, we would have carried on, no problem, and we would have produced the global strategy just a few days, presented it at the European Council that was only 4 or 5 days later. If there would have been a Brexit vote, we would have not. And we would have, sort of reflected, cried, reflected, mourned, and then we would have seen what to do. And indeed, that morning, when I put my alarm clock at 5 a.m. in the morning, like I guess many other people, and I saw the news and got a heart attack, and I got a double heart attack. I mean, the first was for Brexit, and the second was because of 2 years of work going down the drain all of a sudden. And that morning, sort of sending text messages with the HRVP, and she said, let me make some phone calls, and I need to figure out what to do. And my understanding was we were not going to go ahead. So much so that I booked a holiday at the beach. And off I go Friday evening to the beach, only to speak to the HRVP that evening, and she says to me, we're going ahead. And she said, we're going ahead because the work is done. Now, what does she mean by the work is done? It was not the simple, the work is done, the strategy is there. The deeper political meaning, and it goes back to this issue about unity, was, this is a time politically in which all the talk is about disintegration. It's about the domino effect after Brexit. The most, existential probably moment in the whole history of the European Union. And little as a piece of the puzzle as it may be, the global strategy is ultimately something that demonstrates that we can still be united. Why? Because this is a text that is 10,000 words long, that was negotiated line by line, word by word, comma by 28, yes, 28 member states, by the Commission, everyone included in 2 years of work, and the work was done. So politically speaking, if not 48 hours after Brexit, then when to send out a message of, yes, we can still be united. So that political rationale was really instrumental in determining the timing of the strategy at a moment in which, frankly speaking, it was not the obvious choice for her to make, and many also criticized that choice at that particular point in time. But she was always absolutely convinced that actually it was the right thing to do. And I'll come to this towards the end of my speech, I think that facts have actually vindicated the fact that she was correct. Anyway, so these three rationales really determined, as I said, the approach, the content, and the timing of the global strategy. Now let me briefly move on to the process. How was all this produced? And again, the methods that were used were hybrid methods that were the product of the fact that this was a hybrid exercise, meaning I was involved in it. Behind my back, I had, my own think tank, I had the EUISS, I had basically my world, and my world is this world, it's you guys. So there was that part of it. There were the institutions, and there was obviously the political level. And those three dimensions, again, very much shaped the way in which the actual process was designed. So the outsider developed all sorts of devious methods to design this process. So just to give you a couple of anecdotes and sort of points about this. Essentially, it was clear to me that I needed to have regular contact with the member states and with the Commission. So I organized, we appointed points of contact from the 28 member states that I saw once a month regularly. Likewise, we sort of set up a Commission task force in which, as part of the task force, there were representatives for pretty much every DG representing the external dimension of that DG. So from research and infrastructure to mobility, energy, apart from obviously the obvious ones, development and trade and neighborhood, etc. So saw these two groups regularly. Now, fairly early on, I immediately understood that I would start getting kind of inundated by non-papers. And I really started fearing that all this stuff that I was getting was really going to be quite useless if it wasn't directed somewhat. And so I decided, and it wasn't kind of a normal way of proceeding, but I decided to send out these questionnaires, because I really felt quite strongly that the skeleton of the global strategy had to be a top-down skeleton in order to have some sort of both political and analytical clarity. It could not be too democratic the way it was done. But the flesh obviously had to come from everyone else, from the member states, from the Commission, etc. And so I felt that by sending out these questionnaires that were basically organized along the skeleton that we had in mind would enable us to solicit input that would actually be useful to the overall, if you like, design that we had in mind. So I sent out these questionnaires, and I remember a meeting. This was a meeting with the Commission, in which I explained the fact that I was distributing these questionnaires, and they had to work on them over the Christmas holidays, and beginning of January they had to had a deadline to send their input in. And I said, well, please, when you answer the questions, don't simply tell me what you're doing now. Don't tell me what you're going to do tomorrow. Don't even tell me what you're going to want to do in 1 year. Just really think outside the box and, tell me what you would like to see happen in 5 or 6 years. And so one hand goes up, and his colleague says, Nathalie, you need to understand. No, sorry, before I say that. And I said to him, think outside the box, imagine, sort of be creative and think outside the box. So hand goes up, says, Nathalie, you need to understand something. We can't think outside the box. We are the box. But actually, he was wrong. He was wrong, because being solicited in a clear way, actually the input that I received was incredibly valuable. Valuable in a way in which I could not have received from the outside world. Because you need to be in the mechanism, in the machine, to really have that nitty-gritty detail. Then obviously you need to bring back to another, a certain level of abstraction again, but you need to know those nitty-gritty details in order to go back to that level of abstraction in a way which actually is meaningful. So, the questionnaire, another devious method that probably no insider would have come up with, was the fact that I understood fairly early on that there is a complete, I feel a bit embarrassed with Thierry here, but there's a real obsession with text and words. And officials love track changes. They absolutely love track changes. Everything gets track changed. And in fact, so much so, going back to the questionnaires, that at some point I remember one returned the questionnaire not with the answers to the questions, but with the track changed questions themselves. Anyway, so there's this real obsession with text and commas and words and everything. And of course, at some point, words matter. But I felt that if we were immediately, sort of 6 months, 8 months before, to get bogged down in the words and the commas, we would just lose the forest for the trees, And so what I did was, indeed, I was already drafting the various chapters of the global strategy. But when I met both with the Commission and with the member states, I asked a colleague to summarize me. And that is the text that I distributed. And I made sure that I told to everyone that actually this was not my writing. There's no point quibbling over the words, because this was not going to be the actual text. But all the content was there. I mean, these summaries were not really summaries. They were rewritten, but they were pretty much the same length as the actual chapter. But it really enabled, I felt, a sort of conversation about the content and not about the fine wording. That would come afterwards. But then, of course, so this was kind of, devious me coming from the outside. But then what couldn't have come from me was the sort of sensibility of knowing when was important to speak with whom and how much. And this had, in a sense, less to do with the actual content and more to do with the so-called buy-in. So I kept on hearing this word buy-in, buy-in. You need to get buy-in from the member states. You need to get buy-in from this and that and the other. And of course I understood that buy-in essentially meant, and again, I could have never had the knowledge to know when was the right moment and the appropriate moment for me to speak to the Political and Security Committee, when did I have to speak to the Military Committee, when did I have to speak to political directors, to security directors, to defense directors, to Secretary Generals of Ministries of Foreign Affairs, and the list gets longer. Now, were these meetings useful for content? No. The content meetings were my regular monthly meetings with the Commission and the Member States, because it's there that I could go through, detail chapter by chapter, bit by bit of the entire thing. With all of these other levels, which were generally much higher levels than the ones that I regularly met, but they felt they needed to also have something, a say in this. That's what buy-in means. So going over and doing the same presentation over and over again, but then everyone felt that they were part of this process. And as I said, that is something that I couldn't have known as someone coming from the outside. And I needed to have, sort of colleagues in the EAS in particular that steered me into this process. And then obviously another thing that came from the outside, the outsider, if you like, in this process was the fact that there was so much engagement with, if you like, civil society broadly understood, and it's not just the over 50 conferences in every single capital, it's the meetings here in Oslo, in Japan, in the US, in Australia, etc. But it's also, the student essay competition. It's the op-eds commission to the various experts. I mean, it's an entire process that was constructed because it was constructed also by someone that was coming from the outside and that understood how important it is to get that input coming from the outside world into the actual content of the strategy itself. Anyway, moving on to the content itself of the global strategy, and again reflecting how the content reflects the input from these different worlds. I would say that the outsider contributed to what I think is a fairly analytical organization of the text. Again, it wasn't something that would have probably come from the institutions. There is a far greater tendency to organize things in sort of perhaps more concrete terms, through geographies, so what do we say about Russia, and what do we say about China, and what do we say about Africa? And I really strongly felt that that would have made the strategy basically be out of date in 3 weeks, i.e. it would not have been a strategy. So I insisted quite a lot for a different organization of the text. I had to give in on various issues. In particular, I remember that what is currently the goal on regional cooperative orders, I initially wanted to organize according to 4 cardinal point, sort of directions, sort of a north, a south, and east and west. But the geographies that would have led to would have been a bit too complicated for the institution. So when I first presented it, the member states looked at me like I was completely mad. Anyway, so I gave in on that one. But at the same time, I wanted to avoid very classical geographies. So I did insist, for instance, in keeping the Middle East and Africa together. There are so many interactions across regions, that at times the way in which institutions are organized geographically leads so many of these interactions basically to escape us. And, you know, I mean, as I said, there are some very obvious examples, both if we think East, if we think Russia, China, if we think South, if we think, as I said, Middle East, Africa. But anyway, there was a sort of give and take on both sides, I think, on that one. Another interesting debate that really was a debate that reflected different debates, be it within academia and within the institutions, was the whole interest values business. So, you know, in academia, I'm slightly simplifying here because it's a very complicated debate, but I would say that there has been a dominant narrative, and I was hinting at this before, which is, yes, you know, the EU speaks interest, but actually it does values. It speaks values, but actually it does interests. Then there are slightly more complicated stories that emerge from academia, meaning actually it's quite difficult to disentangle the two, but I would say that that has been a, you know, sort of values versus interests approach coming from one strand, if you like, of academia. Then come the institutions and the member states that say, no, it's hand in hand. It's values and interests, you know, and the two go together, but still looking at them as very different things that, you know, have to coexist and come along together. And I think putting those together, perhaps with a slightly constructivist bias in all of this, I insisted very strongly in actually only talking about interests, but doing it in a way which would embed values, that made it obvious that actually one informs the other and vice versa. And I really had to fight this one out. It wasn't easy because although, you know, if I were to put myself in a box, I would say I definitely would put myself in the values box. And here I was suddenly advocating to only talk about interests. It became actually quite bizarre because I knew where I was coming from, but all of a sudden my best allies were those that were kind of into the interests in the tough sense of the word. So all of a sudden it was me and the French, you know, fighting this out. But of course I was coming from a completely sort of opposite direction to this debate. And so again, you know, to me it was fascinating the way in which this really, you know, it was this sort of constant conversation between the outside world and the inside, if you like, world. Anyway, let me move on because I think I've been speaking for far too long. But let me just move on to the what next, the what next after a strategy. And in all honesty, I think that already when we began this particular process on the global strategy, there was a very strong push, particularly from the member states, to insist that this had to be an actionable strategy. And in this respect, very different from the 2003 precedent. 2003 precedent, according to its authors, Javier Solana and Robert Cooper, is not a strategy. If by strategy we mean something that puts in relation ends to means. Robert would describe the 2003 European security strategy more as a strategic concept. And I think he's right. And the point is that back in 2003, there was no need to act, or rather to change action, because things were actually going fairly well, or so we thought. And so the purpose of the strategy, it goes back to what is the motivation. The motivation of that strategy was a narrative that would bring everyone together. It need not be actionable, therefore, because it was all about creating that narrative. Quite obvious in 2015, 2016, that the global strategy couldn't stop there, that it would not have been judged as a success had it simply come up with a nice and convincing narrative that would have helped. I mean, it wouldn't have resolved all differences and divisions, but it would have somehow helped bring everyone together. And I think it did, to an extent, achieve that function. But as I said, the bar when it comes to the global strategy is higher. Now, it's been now, what, a year and a half since the global strategy was produced. And in all honesty, I can say that never in my wildest dreams would I have thought that being actionable would have been taken so much to the letter. And Again, in all honesty, it's not because the global strategy is great. It's because there has been a number of different factors that both preceded the global strategy and obviously came after the global strategy that really led to a pretty unprecedented alignment of the stars. And when I mean actionable, I'm here specifically thinking about what I think is one of the big messages of the global strategy, which is basically this idea of the European Union becoming more responsible for itself and achieving strategic autonomy, which then has very clear security and defense connotations and dimensions to it. Now, what has been the story here? The story was brewing, obviously, when the strategy was being produced, and that is why there is such a strong push for the security of our union, which ended up being the first goal of the global strategy. It was not, and that was not what I had imagined at all. In my original table of contents, we started global, and then we worked our way back and ended up with the security of the union. But the member states were not very happy with me, and so I had to reverse that order. So there was a very strong push for this already back then. Why? Well, the reason is obvious: insecurity rising, crises everywhere. Alongside this, there's a public opinion story, which I think is also another important piece of the puzzle, meaning although now it's slightly improved, as you were saying, we're back into slightly more optimistic days, but already, even back then, although the pessimism was high, although the Euroscepticism was extremely high, interestingly, that Euroscepticism did not affect security and defense. In fact, majorities across all member states, including the United Kingdom, funnily enough, want to see more Europe, literally in these terms, when it comes to security and defense. So basically, this is an easy one to push for if you're a politician. It makes sense, and you've got public opinion that supports you. So those were the two reasons that preceded, if you like, were already there when we were working on the global strategy. Then comes the strategy, and then comes a cascade of different factors. Factor number one, Brexit. Now, the Brexit story is a story that is as much about fact as it is about fiction. And now, it is a fact that the United Kingdom has been a brake when it comes to European defense. And that, in particular, it has been a brake on specific aspects related to European defense. The whole debate, for instance, about a European headquarter for EU military missions and operations. This is something that the Brits were particularly uneasy with. Likewise, beginning the work on a permanent structured cooperation, a PESCO. These were two points on which the Brits were definitely uneasy. Reason why in the global strategy itself, they are in the text. I know where they are. But they are not explicit in the text. So in the text we talk, I can't remember exactly the wording on it, but we mention both, but in a slightly hidden way. Because, of course, the consensus and the Brits were still fairly opposed to this. But then the real story about the UK referendum is a story about perception, about mood. And the general feeling was, and the general conviction, I would say, is that the United Kingdom was brake number one. It was the most important brake to European defense. I don't think that's the case, but what I think is irrelevant, because that is what the majority, I would say, thought. And so the very fact that the UK referendum happened had a dynamic, led to a dynamic in terms of, finally, we're relieved when we can now move forward when it comes to European defense. Whether it's true or false, it's irrelevant. That was the perception, and the perception then becomes a reality. Next factor, of course, is Donald Trump, to whom we're all extremely grateful. Thank God for Donald Trump. Without Donald Trump, we would not be where we are when it comes to European defense. Again, this is a story which is as much about perception as it is about fact. The fact is that the United States has been asking Europeans for a number of years, certainly throughout the Obama administrations, to become more responsible for themselves. That is a fact. But because that message was sent in a graceful, polite, rational way, we didn't get it. Yeah, it didn't. The penny didn't drop. So we needed Donald Trump to send that message in a slightly more direct way. And that, again, has led to a dynamic when it comes to European defense. Then you have the Commission. All of a sudden, again, this was already brewing when we were working on the global strategy. When we were working on the global strategy, the Commission was beginning to have its first conversations, but we asked them, please hold your horses, because this has to come after the global strategy. But it was beginning to work on its European Defence Action Plan, which then led to the work on the European Defence Fund, which is now being worked into the more specific, if you like, instruments that it's going to generate. But already there was indeed the sense that the Commission was going to become an actor in all this. It became then, and it is becoming an increasing reality post-global strategy, indeed with the European Defence Action Plan and everything that came after it, which essentially means that for the first time in history, the European Commission does not consider defence to be a dirty word, and not only does it not consider it to be a dirty word, but it wants to put money into it. And why is money important? Not because of its absolute figures, although they are significant. We are talking, in terms of the next multi-annual financial framework, of 5.5 billion, so it's not peanuts. But 5.5 billion is not the 200 billion that Europeans collectively spend on defence. The reason why it is so significant is that that 5.5 billion, be it on research or be it on capability development, is about spending that money together. And, you know, we've been talking about defence cooperation for a long time, and it hasn't happened. So obviously you need to have some incentives for it to happen, and money tends to be an incentive in these things. So the Commission, so you have Brexit, you have Trump, you have the Commission, you have Germany. And Germany is a key player in all of this. Again, this comes from a national, I would say German, evolution of a debate when it comes to defence matters. And I think that debate has now led to a decision. Germany wants to invest in defence. We now know that. But if you're Germany in an age of Trump, it's difficult to sell it in NATO terms. It really does kind of come across as you're doing it because Donald Trump asked you to do it, which isn't the sexiest thing to sell to public opinion. If you're Germany, because of your history, you cannot sell it through a national narrative. That doesn't go down too well. So for Germany to have a European framing for what is ultimately a national decision became essential. So you have Germany really starting to push on this question. And then last but not least is France. Now, France had an interesting evolution because although when we were working on the global strategy, it was, as I said, up there saying, security in the Union, Europeans need to get more responsible and strategic autonomy, and that's all they cared about, to be honest. The rest of the text could have basically said anything. That is all they cared about. Then, after the strategy was released, and therefore in the last months of the Hollande presidency, France basically went through a brakes-on phase. It was still obviously very interested in defence, but it was not at all convinced that the EU was the way to do it. And it had a tendency to want to do this more pragmatically, maybe bilaterally, maybe even in a NATO framework. But it was not so convinced that the procedural, institutional way for the EU to do things was the way to get things done on defence. So France had its break on until basically the election of Emmanuel Macron. And then all of a sudden, with the president like him, obviously the terms of the debate completely changed. And they therefore reset in motion the Franco-German motor when it comes in particular to defence. And that is a key tandem to have when it comes to defence, because you need to have, if you like, the German tendency towards inclusivity and process and making everyone feel comfortable. But if you only have that, then you essentially tend to lack ambition. And so you need the French to reinstill some oomph into all of this. And putting these two together so I think really sort of set in motion a train, which I think now is very clearly leaving the station. So how does this all relate back to the global strategy? I mean, I think, we are indeed moving to what I would generally define as a security and defence union. What is a security and defence union? It's basically a system through all these mechanisms that are being set in place, a coordinated annual review on defense, the European Defense Fund, a permanent structured cooperation between member states, a military planning and conduct capability that we cannot call a headquarter, but that's what it is. So all of these things put together, essentially, I think, boil down to three things. First, you do defense research together. So you have the incentives now for the first time to do research together. You know, for us in the world of research, not defense research, but research, know how important, for instance, Horizon 2020 projects are, and how much through Horizon 2020 and before then framework programs, we do research together much more than what we used to. So having a similar kind of mechanism when it comes to defense research, again, provides incentives that did not exist before. So you do defense research together. You think defense together. You then make the capabilities together. You build them together. You procure to them together. You know, you buy them together. And, you know, through these mechanisms, this is basically what is going to happen. And then you do operations together. And again, this is partly where PESCO comes in, where the headquarter comes in, etc. So all of this, I think, is leaving the station literally now. I mean, some bits have already left the station. PESCO we're going to see by the end of the year. So all this is happening now. Last thing I want to say, and then I close, is, well, you know, so what about the global strategy? I mean, this would have happened anyway. And of course it would have happened anyway. But I think the global strategy and the fact that the order was kept, you know, you have the global strategy first and then you have a number of things coming after, has created not only a narrative but a process which has enabled basically what that third political rationale that I was first referring to actually persist, unity. So the fact that you do have an overarching text, an overarching framework within which you even have the Irish that are into this defense debate because they recognize themselves into something that they worked on. And so it really helps, if you like, to keep that unity, which, as I said, was the ultimate political rationale for engaging in this process in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nathalie, for a very interesting presentation. It's very interesting to hear about how you have worked with the strategy, the reasoning for it, and so thank you so much. You can sign up now for questions. I would just start with one question myself, and you actually ended it on it, what I wanted to ask about, because what if you didn't have this strategy? Will this kind of this positive or kind of this process that we see now would have happened anyway? And you said that maybe this would have happened anyway, but that it gives some kind of structure to it, and maybe also that all the countries have been part of the process and therefore sign up to it. But I wonder, since this strategy has been kind of drafted by you as kind of outside the box, in a sense, does it also affect the status of the text as such? And to what extent do you think in the long term, how will it, what will that kind of, could that affect the process or not? Positively or negatively. And would like you to start with that. And while you are responding, you can just sign up for questions.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Now, there was a big debate. Well, so firstly on the status of the strategy. Indeed, this is a document by the HRVP. No more, no less. Why? Because, well, it's not a joint communication. We did not go through an inter-service consultation. So we did not do it in the normal institutional way. So indeed, it does have a different status. Now, there was a big debate after the strategy was published as to, you know, so well, there were two phases of the debate. The first was, how should the European Council respond to this? And actually, there were most member states that would have been happy with the European Council welcoming the global strategy. But then at that particular point in time, there were some specific, very legal issues. And in particular, the fact that you have some member states, 3 or 4, if I remember correctly, that because of their own internal procedures, have to go through their parliaments. Even for the welcoming of a political document. Anyway, never mind, that's what they have to do. And so because of the Brexit campaign, of the referendum campaign, we did not officially, although everyone saw the text, because everyone was invited into what I called confessionals. They had 2 hours to read the text in the last month or so, and we did this 3 times, and they had their confessional in which they would suggest changes and revisions. So they had all seen it, but their official institutions had not. Their parliaments had not. So for a number of member states, it was a problem. And that is why in June, the European Council just welcomed the presentation or something odd like that. Then the more interesting debate was in October. So come October, and everyone loves, all the member states love the global strategy so much, and they really feel that this is their thing. And so they had exactly your question, how, in order for us to have real ownership of this, we need to welcome it, we need to adopt it, we need to do something, And all, apart from one that I will not name because we're on streaming, all would have been happy just to adopt it, not even welcome it, just adopt it. The one that did not had no problem with the strategy, had problem with other policy areas. I name no names, but it had not got, well, it's related somewhat to foreign policy, but it's not really foreign policy. You can kind of possibly guess what that is and who that, what that member state is. Anyway, so for that reason, and so, so what should we do now? What should we do? And actually, the HRVP was very unconcerned with all of this. She really felt, does anyone really care whether the council welcomes the presentations, adopts, accepts, takes note? I mean, do people care? Does it matter? She's convinced it does not. And I think, again, it goes back to this, which world are you coming from? And certainly that world, her world, the world of politics, does not. It is mainly the world of institutions that cares. So she was very unconcerned. In the institutions, people were very, what should we do? And including officials from the member states, including the diplomats from the member states, they were very concerned. So we decided to just simply jump that hurdle altogether. So not use any welcoming, adoption, acceptance, etc. But if I remember correctly, the words of the council conclusions in October of last year, it basically says something along the lines of the global strategy will be implemented. So it just, sort of jumps the hurdle altogether. But presumably, if you're going to be implementing something, well, then you will have accepted it, But yes, there's lots of semantic wars going on in Brussels.
That's interesting. Okay, we have one question over here. And then Helene. And just sign up if you...
My name is Kjell Stamnes. I'm a private participant here. The first question, I have 2 questions. The first question is the following. Bearing in mind that the EU is an institution on behalf of the population, or a tool for all the population here, could you, and if you were going to explain to the population in EU what are the main objective or objectives with an EU global strategy? The second question is, you are, at the end of your speech here, you were talking about defense and security as an important part here. But when it comes to defense, we already have NATO, which is the tool for Europe to defend themselves. Why then prioritize and build up something within EU?
Okay, so do you want to collect questions?
You want to, yeah.
Okay, so the basic message, what is this all about, in a way that, the public can understand. And I relate this also to the second question, actually. I think they're very much related. I think the basic message is Europe has to become more responsible for itself on foreign and security policy matters. Why? Because no one else is going to do it for us. For a long time, we had others doing it for us, and in particular, I'm thinking about the United States. So we have to grow up and become more responsible, and actually, all our member states are fairly small. And so only by doing it together can we hope to, if you like, protect and promote our interests and values in the world. So I would say that's a very basic message. Does it mean that we therefore have a magic wand to solve conflicts and crises? No. No, the world is a messy place, and that is why we talk about promoting the resilience of states and societies in surrounding regions. That's why we talk about an integrated approach to conflicts and crises. These are messy situations that we're enmeshed in, we have to do something about them, but we don't have a magic wand to fix these problems. So I would say this is the overall narrative that basically comes out of the global strategy, sort of enabling us to grow up and become more responsible for ourselves without giving ourselves the illusion that we can solve all problems in the world, basically. To the NATO question, because it's very much related. I would say that these are two, and it's not a coincidence that this European defense story is accelerating so much precisely at the time in which EU-NATO relations have never been so strong. Because actually there's a very clear connection between the two. So I would say EU-NATO relations 1.0. What was the story at the beginning? I think the story at the beginning was basically a story of division of labor. NATO does hard security, and defense in particular. EU does soft security. And so there's a division of labor. And the whole debate was indeed the having the 3 Ds, no duplication, sort of keeping the EU out of NATO matters. Then you start entering into a different world, and it's a world in which actually you cannot separate the hard and the soft. Just think about hybrid destabilization, hybrid warfare. I mean, this is about the harder and softer ends actually coming together. In the EU, we used to call it a comprehensive approach, or now an integrated approach. When we talk about Russia, we talk about hybrid warfare. But sort of the tools are actually quite similar. They're used in completely different ways, but it's the similar kind of concept, really. So this led to a mutual need. So this, I would say, is EU-NATO relations 2.0, which means NATO starts needing some of the softer stuff. The EU needs, obviously, the harder stuff, and therefore they need to work together. They're actually working in pretty much very similar theatres of operation, be it in the Mediterranean, be it in the East, in Ukraine, and they need one another. So this is, I think, the story that we're still in now. What is the story moving forward? And I think that's, if you like, the EU-NATO 3.0, which I think is the most interesting story. Now, everything that is being done within the EU is aimed at essentially driving European defense cooperation. Why do we need defense cooperation? Because moving forward, there will not be one member state, possibly France, but I don't think even France, and the United Kingdom, that will have what is known as full spectrum capabilities in the years ahead, because we're too small. So essentially, sort of researching and building and buying and then using this stuff together is the only way for Europe as a whole to be secure and be more responsible. Now, the capabilities that are going to be produced, so say, for example, through defense cooperation, you end up with whatever, new model for a tank or something, or a drone program, or whatever it is. These will still belong to those member states that have cooperated in building this stuff. If those member states are NATO member states, they can use that capability in a NATO framework. There is nothing that prevents them. The EU does not say, you build this capability and therefore you can only use it for an EU operation. It's your stuff. You use it for what you want. You can use it for a UN peacekeeping operation. You can use it for a NATO operation. You can use it in a multinational framework. So this is why actually NATO itself has really started changing its tune when it comes to European defense. And it's incentivizing the EU to do more. In the same way as I think a very interesting debate that has already started in the context, for example, of PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation between member states, is what is the role of third countries, and in particular non-EU third countries in NATO? Who's that? You know, can they participate in some PESCO projects, although not being within PESCO itself? You know, again, because everything that we're trying to do is trying to make Europeans, not the EU, Europeans, be more capable when it comes to security and defense.
I think that this also line up to what you said, that the EU has become more pragmatic in its approach, and also France, I think, in order when it comes to European defense, it's to develop, stronger NATO and also a stronger European defense dimension together. It's not either or, which is often has been interpreted that way in Norway, at least. Okay, I will give the floor to Helene. Helene Sjursnæt-Arena.
Thanks for your speech, Natalia. Fascinating as always. I have two questions. The first one has to do with what you hint at the beginning of your presentation, that one of the reasons why you thought it was necessary with a global strategy was that the world has changed. So a need to rethink what should be the EU's role in that world. And is there a need to shift emphasis? So you mentioned normative power Europe and this whole idea, and then you move on to say, well, now we talk about principled pragmatism. I'm not going to argue with you about whether or not it's an oxymoron, but I wonder if you could explain what precisely is the difference between the idea of normative power Europe, as Barroso would claim the EU was a normative power, and the EU emphasizing principled pragmatism. Because now you emphasize that the pragmatic side is about how you assess the world out there, and surely even a normative power Europe would be reasonably pragmatic in doing so. So what really is the difference? So that's the first part of the first question. The second part of that question then is, when you move on to discuss implementation, that whole issue of what's the sort of the underlying direction of the EU in the world disappears, and you talk about security and defense. So I completely agree. This is a very significant development. Nevertheless, that's more about building a polity and giving that polity certain tools to use in global politics. The question then remains, how are you going to use those tools, right? So back to the sort of the general orientation of EU foreign policy. So my question then is, what would be signs of a shift in that overall direction? So in terms of implementation, do you see any signs of a kind of a shift of emphasis in that overall outlook? And is there any internal discussion on what that shift might be? What would it imply in terms of how the EU relates to great powers, to the UN, whatever, you know, big issues of foreign policy? So that's the first question. The second question is about defense and security. I think you sum it up very nicely with these 3 points, you know, defense research, procurement and capabilities, and then joint training. If we relate this development to the academic literature about differentiation, would you say that the developments that we observe in security and defense go counter to the almost standard argument that we have, at least in the academic literature at the moment, that we see a more differentiated Europe? Because once you start building defense, you are actually building a polity that becomes quite similar to a state. So is there a kind of a tension in that understanding of the Union?
Okay, so on the first part of the first question, how does this differ from the, how does principled pragmatism differ from the normative power Europe debate? I would say that the normative power debate or the normative power understanding of the EU was not particularly pragmatic, to the extent that it made quite a lot of assumptions about the external world. And those assumptions were not particularly pragmatic. So there was an overall assumption that everyone wanted to end up looking like the European Union, that everyone shared the same values, and that it was simply a kind of difficult process perhaps to get there, but that everyone at some point would get to the Holy Land. And that was the general understanding in the way in which it was conceived, which is why then when the EU started, if you like, contradicting itself, when actually the world out there did not particularly want to look like the EU and you still had to deal with it, it ended up in this whole debate of, see, you're still dealing with them, therefore you're actually just pursuing your interests. So I would say I'm sort of slightly simplifying here and schematizing, but I think that's basically the gist of where it was going. I thought of principal pragmatism in the Christmas of 2015, yes, when I was rereading David Campbell's Politics Without Principle book. So this was basically, his main argument against, slightly simplifying. He was referring back not to the 2003 war, but to the 1990-91 war, Gulf War. And he was basically making the argument that, the politics without principle is actually the principled policy. Meaning, and in a sense, the argument is even clearer if you apply it to the 2003 war in Iraq, which is basically saying, we said that we were doing it to spread democracy. So, in the name of principle, in the name of values, we committed some pretty horrendous atrocities. And so he was referring to the principle of sovereignty when he was describing the 1991, but again, it's a principle. And so, again, and that really made me reflect about this the principle that lies in having a more pragmatic view of a situation. Not coming out there with your preconceived ideas of what is good and what is bad, but actually lowering yourself and maybe even dirtying your hands with the reality. Because unless you have that more pragmatic or realistic understanding of that reality, you actually don't act in a very principled way very often. And that, I think, and it goes back to this, this whole point that I'm trying to drive across as to why I think it's so important for academia and for practice to be more in contact with one another. Because it's far too easy when you're on the outside of simply judging something that someone does on the inside through a particular, by using a particular lens, and not really putting yourself in that, person's shoes at that particular point in time when he or she has to decide to go one way or another. And he or she may be completely driven by principle, but it's a messy situation, There is not an obvious thing to do at times. So it's really trying to capture this idea of not assuming that the world wants to look like us, not assuming that we have the holy grail of truth of what is right and what is wrong, and that actually that more pragmatic view is principled. So that's the sort of general understanding that is probably lost on most people reading the global strategy. That's what I was trying to sort of convey. On the second part of your first question, implementation, is there something more than security and defense? I think, in all honesty, the security and defense bit is the most concrete aspect where there has been implementation. Is there implementation on the rest? I would say yes. I think if you think, and it goes back to this principle pragmatism business. Think about resilience. So it's not just about having a joint communication on resilience. Who cares about a joint communication? But the point is it actually changing the way in which people do their daily work? And I would say that yes, there is a growing assumption that there is not a linear progression towards democratization, modernization, Europeanization, all good things. There are lots of ups and downs, and that we need to embed, we need to sort of factor in those ups and downs, and that therefore building resilience in its various dimensions, be it climate, be it energy, be it infrastructure, be it economy, is something that policymakers are beginning to think more about. I mean, it's a slow process, but I can sense that there is something there. Likewise, for the integrated approach to conflicts and crisis, I think there's a lot more attention than what there used to be to the local level of conflicts, which was one of the big points that we're trying to drive across in the global strategy. It's very clear in the way in which we're working on Iraq, I think, on Syria, and also on Libya. But in all honesty, I would agree with you that the heart of it is really the security and defense bit, and it is indeed about policy building rather than policy making. But then I would also say, well, isn't strategy making about identity building to an extent? It's about figuring out who you are as much as figuring out what you want to do, or rather figuring out what you want to do in order to figure out who you are. So I think it's not, I think the reason why there's so much emphasis on security and defense is because of all of the other factors that have nothing to do with the global strategy. But I think there is something there as to why this bit is so important at this particular point in time. On the defense, does this go against differentiated integration? No, I would say it goes exactly in this direction, and PESCO is the reason why. We wouldn't be having, let's see, they should have sent their notification yesterday. They didn't in the end. They've postponed it to next week. Let's see how many member states sign up to this. My personal guess is that it's going to be not 4 or 5, but certainly not 26 without the UK and without Denmark, but somewhere in between. So, and to me, PESCO is going to be the heart of a European defense union, however we want to call it. Why? Because it's basically not only is it the place where you have the commitments there, member states sign up, council decision on a number of commitments that have a number of fairly ambitious commitments in terms of what they will be doing together. But it's also the silver lining that joins everything else up, So you have a European Defence Fund. It's not exclusive to the PESCO members, so everyone can apply for it. But there is a PESCO bias in the way in which the fund is going to be administered. Likewise, we're going to set up, they are setting up a coordinated annual review on defense, and this will include all member states. But for the PESCO members, participating in this coordinated annual review on defense has a more binding character. So there is an element of differentiation, which basically is due to the fact that, if we had been able to do this at 26, it would have happened already. And the reason why there is a PESCO conversation is that I think there is a growing acknowledgement that we're not going to do it at 26.
Thank you so much. We have 2, 3, 4 more questions. Okay, first here.
Thank you. My name is Eivind Hoffman. As a member of the Norwegian contact point for the European Migration Network, I wanted to ask you a question on migration, which is seen, at least in the public debate, as part of the security issues. The impression I have at the moment is that the European Union's actions in this area is to build Fortress Europe with 2 small gates, 2 narrow gates. One is to give protection to people who actually need it, and some governments in European member states are actually think that they should respect international obligations in this area. The other gate is to allow in highly skilled workers from third countries, and this may be seen as a response to the growing demographic imbalances in Europe. Do you see these development as consistent with the strategy?
You want to collect? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Marianne Lidwell. I thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And I have 2 questions. One follows up on Helene's question as well, I guess, because I would like to come back to the question that you started with. The question that Cooper raised about why we need, or the EU needs a global strategy? Because you gave, or maybe you've given 4 reasons. Then you have the institutional rationale, you have the different crises facing the EU, right? And the need to show unity and this identity building that Helene referred to and you confirmed. And all of these reasons are, of course, very much linked to the EU as such. So why does the EU then, if this is about security and defense, handling crisis, why a global strategy? Why does the EU need to be active all over the globe? What is kind of the EU's role in Asia or whatever, like, yeah. So why a global strategy? And also, I also have a question also that just, I'm curious if you could say a bit more about some of the main challenges that you faced. You said that all the different areas and even the commas were discussed, negotiated. What were the kind of the main disagreements, for example? What were the most difficult areas?
Yeah.
Of course, NATO, but the concepts like territorial defense are always difficult, or capabilities, for example. Yeah. Thanks.
I start with the last question to answer the first. Migration was the hardest one. And so I'll then come to the other hard ones, but let me just begin with migration. Now, migration was the hardest one because everyone agreed on, in a sense, what should have been the remit of the global strategy, which is external. So there's no real disagreement in terms of what to do externally. So we all now agree, don't we, that we have to give our development aid in a manner which is more tailored and targeted to migration. We all agree that there has to be, lots of humanitarian assistance in countries indeed facing crisis. So we all agree that we have to, trade. I mean, we have to tailor a set of different external instruments, from security to trade to development to humanitarian assistance, with a migration lens. This translates into keeping them at home. Everyone agrees on that. No dispute. The problem, of course, is what is not, or rather should not have been, in the global strategy, but is, which is on the internal side. Now, we pushed on this a lot, and we had to concede a bit, but not everything, because I think there were a number of member states, and you can imagine whom, that would have preferred to say absolutely nothing on the internal side. And of course, if we had to say something on the internal side, it had to be labor migration and protection. On the sort of migration on the asylum side. The gates, if you like, as you put them. So some would have preferred not to have that at all. And, and they were saying, well, it's a foreign policy strategy, But then we were saying, well, it's all about the internal-external nexus. And how can you talk about migration that is par excellence the area where there is an internal-external nexus without saying anything at all on the internal? As I said, it was an area in which there was, in earlier drafts, there was a lot more on the internal stuff, sort of going as far as talking about a common migration policy and a common asylum policy, a genuine common migration policy and common asylum policy, which of course we don't have. There was quite a lot of pushback on that, but we did resist the point about eliminating the internal stuff altogether. And this was something that the HRVP herself felt very strongly about. She also felt very strongly about going back to words and the importance of words and how words are used in never using migration in a securitized way. So even in terms of the way in which the sort of order of words, there is never migration coming after terrorism or vice versa. There's always something in between, energy or trade or, something else, but never associating these two things. And this is something that she was extremely careful about. At times it even slipped my attention, so she was very, very careful about this point. But I would say that, yes, migration was, going back to the second question, it was the hardest one. I would also say that had the strategy, I mean, you know, time matters in these things. So migration, I would say, was the hardest one because of when the actual text was written. Had the text been written the year before, without a shadow of a doubt, Russia would have been the hardest issue. Was there disagreement about Russia? Yes, there was. But I think already by 2015, you know, we had been already, you know, 2 years almost into the crisis. Everyone knew where the other stood. Everyone knew that if you pulled the blanket too much one end, the other end would remain uncovered. Everyone had an interest in having a position, a sort of EU position on Russia. And so they accepted the fact that they had to compromise, basically. But it's difficult to compromise up until when you really know what everyone's red lines are. And that takes time to reveal those red lines, you know. So Russia was difficult, but it was not the hard. I would say migration was definitely harder than Russia. Other difficult ones were, yes, absolutely European defense. So, you know, it goes back to this conversation about NATO that we were having. But again, I think in the end, everyone kind of agreed that if European defense was framed in a particular way, it would actually be to the benefit of NATO too. So that in the end was resolved. And then the one issue that it was actually quite surreal this moment because, as I said, you know, sort of we went ahead 48 hours after Brexit. I mean, unprecedented crisis. Oh my God. Last changes, last minute. So, you know, I was telling you the fact that I went to the beach. And then Federica told me, you know, make the last changes that you want to make. Then let's speak the next day. And we go through the changes you've made, and then we go ahead. Anyway, so by this stage, you know, the family was at the beach. I couldn't not go. So I go to the beach too with my computer. And I sit in a cafe, you know, my bikini, on my computer for hours. And then for another 4 hours on the telephone with her, going through all the changes. Finally, it seems like it's done. And then all of a sudden, the last disagreement erupts between two member states. I will not say which ones, but there was a large one and a small one. And it was a big disagreement about contact groups. And I thought to myself, this is surreal. I mean, Brexit, you know, referendum 48 hours ago, and here you are discussing about contact groups, you know. But there was, you know, it was this general, on the one hand, again, slightly simplifying here, large member state impulse of doing things that work, smaller formats work, you know, like E3+3, Minsk, etc. And the resistance coming from smaller member states feeling basically excluded from this. And I'm glad that in the end, the paragraph survived. I mean, it got to the point, it was kind of midnight on that Saturday evening that I thought I'll probably have to just delete this whole paragraph altogether. In the end, the agreement was found, and I'm very happy that it was, because actually I think it's one of the most interesting paragraphs in the strategy. But those were the big areas of disagreement. Why do we need a global strategy? Well, I would say, as I said, you know, sort of to me the most interesting interpretation of the global is thematic rather than geographic. But if I had to say something about geography and how this relates to this whole conversation that we've been having, I would say a couple of things. The first is that, you know, this is a strategy that came after a strategic assessment that painted a world that was more contested, more complex, and more connected. That complexity and that connectivity have geographic implications. It means that, and I was hinting at this earlier, you can't chop up geographies very neatly. And what happens in one part of the world affects another. And so even if, and indeed the global strategy, I would say, is primarily concerned with what happens at or close to home. If you think about it, there are 5 goals. One regards the union itself, and the next 2 regard what I call surrounding regions. Surrounding regions because I thought, you know, sort of sticking to the neighborhood is maybe just a bit too narrow. So let's broaden out a bit, but it doesn't include the whole world either. It is about surrounding regions. So 3 out of 5 are very close to home. But does it mean to say that we're not interested in what happens in Asia? Well, if the world is connected, then indeed we are. You know, does it mean that we're not interested in what happens in sub-Saharan Africa? Well, you know, if just think about migration, well, of course we are, you know. So, you know, there was a sense of obviously, and then I would say the last goal, which is the global governance role, has become more important since the global strategy was released because of the election of Donald Trump. And this general sense of the EU needs to stand up for multilateralism. The EU needs to stand up for the United Nations. If we don't, then who will? So I would say that level has also politically risen in terms of priority. Yeah, that's what I want to say.
We're a bit over time, but we have 2 more questions. So if you're okay, and you all are okay with that, we'll take you as once. Christoph first, and then the ambassador.
Thank you, Nathalie. Just a short question about one of the rationales you exposed at the outset, namely the bureaucratic, forgive me for getting into this, the bureaucratic rationales. To what extent the expectations that you recalled in terms of implementation of the Lisbon Treaty, in terms of articulating, using the hybridity of the High Representative Vice President, but also implementing the Lisbon Treaty, how much of these expectations are fulfilled by the global strategy?
Yeah.
Important question. I'm Thierry Béchet, I'm the EU ambassador to Norway. Going back to this notional country, which is not in the EU, close to the EU, not in NATO, suppose that country were to ask you, telling you first, we like the whole idea because our security depends on the security of what's south to us. We want to get close to that. What would you advise them? To do it bilaterally with the EU, to do it through NATO? What would you advise them on that?
To get closer to the defense bit of it.
To the whole thing, yes, exactly.
Thing.
To this security and defense new, the whole thing.
Okay, easy questions. On Christoph's question, sort of, the implementation of Lisbon and how far has this got, particularly after, I would say, the global strategy. How successful was it? I would say that it was successful in some areas and it's still a bit of a failure in others. So I would say that in terms of a method of work, it is becoming more institutionalized. So let me give the example of the joint communication on resilience and the work on the integrated approach. This was really work that the EAS did together with the Commission, hand in hand all along, I would say. So I think it is, the method is being institutionalized. Likewise, I think when it comes to this specific defense angle, Commission, when we were working, for instance, on the implementation plan on security and defense, we established a task force and it had, EDA, it had Commission, it had EAS, it had Cabinet, so everyone was in the loop. So on the if you like, strictly external aspects, the sort of, I think it's working far more. Still a long way to go, but it's working far more. Where I think that we're still very far away is on this whole issue, which we make a big deal out of not only in the global strategy, but perhaps even more so in the Council conclusions of last year that highlight the priorities for implementation, is on this whole internal-external nexus business. Why? Well, we are the externals. We love the internals. We would love to work with them more. They don't particularly like to work with us. That's the problem. Just to give you a very small personal example, it took me the best part, I think it took me about 6 or 7 months after the strategy was released to even have a meeting with the COSI committee, because they weren't interested. Then I finally did have my meeting and I was expecting, we can start talking about some of this stuff. Questions, 0. So it's, there's lots of demand on our side. There's not much supply coming the other way, if you like. On Thierry's question about, how does an external country approach this whole adventure? Well, I would say that, okay, two bits of the answer. One is, what falls into CSDP as we knew it. And there, I think, what is the aspect to watch is, surprise, surprise, Brexit. Why? Because moving back, so thinking back at the late 90s, early 2000s, when the WEU was being closed down, when ESDP was beginning, there were lots of very interesting ideas as to how to include the non-EU NATO members. Obviously, Norway and Turkey were up front there, in forms of decision shaping, although not decision making. Then comes enlargement, then Cyprus comes in, then those ideas are shelved until now. Now comes the whole Brexit debate. Now, there's a big condition to all of this, and the big condition is rationality has to prevail. And it's a very big assumption to make when we're talking about Brexit. But let us assume that the rest of the Brexit madness does not affect this particular area, meaning security and defense. Then you would end, you already do have the United Kingdom. I think this is, if I recall correctly, it's stated quite clearly in the paper that the Foreign Office produced on this a month or so ago, that basically they would not be necessarily interested in participating in CSDP as the current mechanisms allow third country participation. Meaning someone else decides, here we're going to do this mission or this operation, would you like to chip in some troops? Yes, thank you. So
like Norway.
Well, exactly. So the Brits are not particularly interested in that model. Rightly so. Now, if one were to imagine a situation in which that mechanism, so there is a give and take, because when it comes to defense, indeed the United Kingdom has a lot to give. And therefore, I think that as opposed to the rest of the Brexit negotiation, where the bargaining power is extremely unequal, when it comes to this, well, I mean, there's scope for compromise. So with a bit more flexibility on the EU side, and again, if rationality prevails, I think there's scope for a win-win. Now, if that win-win, meaning forms of inclusion in decision shaping, meaning you sit around the table, you listen to the conversation, maybe you can even talk, but you don't vote, but hey, no one votes, so it doesn't really matter, If that were to be allowed in the case of the United Kingdom, well, I struggle to think that it would be excluded for others. No names named. Now, the trickier part, though, of the question is, what about this new stuff that is coming? Where do third countries fit into in there? And that's a difficult, I think, question to answer, because we kind of know what these mechanisms more or less are, but we don't really know what the overall shape of the thing is going to be. So it's difficult to figure out how to place a third country in this. As I said, the closest that one is getting to the beginning of this conversation is in the context of PESCO. And there, there are some member states that have a particularly close relationship with this country and that are already putting up, up there, forefront the debate about third countries. But it's not a simple question to resolve, because the difficulty does not regard so much third countries as much as, going back to differentiation, the EU members that will not participate in a PESCO. So the question is, well, are you going to give third states more access to a PESCO than non-PESCO EU member states? Some say yes, and some say yes because the argument is, well, in the case of non-EU member states, they don't have an option to be in PESCO. In the case of EU member states, well, they can't pick and choose and cherry pick, not buying into the commitments, but buying into specific projects.
To some extent, you have had that with Denmark. I mean, Denmark opting out from the defense and Norway opting in.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
there are some kind of examples of that from before.
Absolutely, absolutely. But as I said, I think it's we're only at the beginning of this debate now. So the only thing I can say is this is a space to watch.
Thank you so much. This has been a very interesting seminar. Maybe you should end by saying where it's possible to buy a book.
Well, there
promotion at the end.
There are flyers there.
Yeah, great.
So on directly from the website, both ebook and hard copies, and I guess you can get it on Amazon as well.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you to everybody for coming.
Thank you.